in the pew and placed her hand on the shoulder of the young woman in front of her who was grieving. She whispered, "Time heals all wounds, honey, and I promise you that, say 20 years from now, the pain that you're feeling right now will have disappeared." And the young woman sat in that pew, and she couldn't believe for a moment that the pain that she was feeling would ever go away. The despair that she was feeling would just one day disappear? No, never. And she tried to say, "No, that's not true," but no words would come out of her mouth. So she just sat there in the pew, hunched over, shaking her head back and forth. She sat there for a moment, thinking, this is a bad dream. It's got to be a nightmare. But it wasn't. She looked up and took a look at her surroundings. She looked at the church choir, all the people sitting in the pews, the priest getting ready to speak, the shiny, polished casket at the front of the altar. She looked at her 2-year-old niece, who was swinging exuberantly through the church pew singing, "My mommy's sleeping, my mommy's sleeping." And she couldn't believe that that pain would ever one day go away. She sat there and looked at the minister and watched the words coming out of his mouth, but she couldn't hear them. There was this horrible, horrible sobbing coming from somewhere around her, and she kept looking around, and she wanted to say, "Shut up! Shut up! This is my sister's funeral. Shut up!" She wanted to hear what the minister was saying, but she couldn't. The old woman reached over. "It's going to be okay, honey." And she realized with horror that those horrible sounds, those sobs, were coming from her. She couldn't imagine that pain ever going away. Ever. Next month marked the 20th anniversary of when that old woman reached out her hand, put her hand on the shoulder of my shoulder to comfort me in my grieving. 20 years since I looked up and saw the gold frame on the casket of my sister, who was 27 years old, lying in that casket, dead of a brain tumor. I never thought I would get over that grief. And I never saw that old woman. I never turned around and looked at her face. And I wish I had. I wish I had, so that 20 years later I could say thank you. I could call her or write her and say thank you. Because while I was angry at her words at the time, those 20 years, every year in February, I've had the opportunity to look back and use that as a baseline. And remember the grief that I felt, the despair I felt, and every year to think the pain has disappeared a little bit more. And I've often thought over the years, what if I were in that lady's shoes? What would I say? What would I do to comfort somebody who is grieving like that, in that pain? What would I say? And it's simple. I'd say the same thing. But the old lady forgot to say something. 20 years of pain does disappear. It makes it easier to talk about. There's not the sobbing and the grief, that deep pain inside. But you learn something else. You learn that that grief is replaced with a more profound grief. 20 years ago I looked at that as my loss, how that loss affected me personally. 20 years now, I look at my daughter and realize she'll never know her Aunt Pauline. The students will never know a great teacher. The world that will not know a wonderful woman. What would I say to somebody right now if they were grieving? I'd reach out my hand, I'd lean over and whisper, "It's going to be okay, honey. Time heals all wounds. And in 20 years, that pain that you're feeling will have disappeared." Mr. Toastmaster.